Howdy folks, welcome to the fourth module of Security Plus, which is called Implement Identity and Access Management. In this fourth module, we have three new course objectives, which I will cover with you guys. The first course objective we'll be covering is Implement Password-Based and Multifactor Authentication. The second objective is Implement Account Policies and Authorization Solutions. And then the third objective is implement sign-on and federated identity solutions. Alright, and then folks, this module consists of three subsections. You will also see them in the video description down below with timestamps for those of you that maybe want to go and jump to a specific topic in a specific section. The first section we'll be covering is called Authentication. That will be followed by the second section, which is called Access Management. And then the last section we'll be covering in this video will be called Identity Management. Alrighty, there you have it, folks. That is the course objectives and the sections we'll be covering in this specific module of the Security Plus course. Now, before we jump into that first section we mentioned, show this video some love and support by giving it a like. It takes tremendous amount of time to create these videos, and for free no less. And then also maybe consider subscribing for those of you who would like to know when the next module or my other content goes live. Alrighty folks, with all the formalities out of the way, let's jump into that first section. Alright folks, let's start with that first section, authentication. The very first topic we've got up in this section is something called Authentication Design. Now before I can explain what it is, we need to just do a quick recap on what authentication actually is, just in case some of you guys don't know or in case you guys don't remember. So authentication in a nutshell is the concept of proving you are the owner to an account or you are the owner to a device. This can be done in many ways, and each of these ways is referred to as a factor. Think of this as a category. So this could be something you know, like a password or a PIN or a phrase. That is a factor, but it's also called a category. It could potentially be something that you have in your possession, on your person. That's also a factor or a category. Now, something that falls into this factor or category would be something like a bank card, smart card, thumb, fob, even your phone, because the phone generally receives an OTP, in other words, a one-time PIN, but it's on a device that you possess. Or maybe on this device, you've got an authenticating app. This could be the Microsoft Authenticating app, the Google Authenticating app, and there's many other ones out there. Either way, it is still something on a device that you possess. A third main factor, which, actually I'm just mentioning the three main ones here, is something that you are, which is normally biometric in nature. So this could be something like a fingerprint scan, retina eye scan, facial recognition, voice recognition, that kind of stuff. So the three I've just mentioned to you folks is the three most common ones, the most widely used ones, but of course not the only used ones. So those are the factors you get when it comes to proving you are who you claim to be, or that you are the owner to this device or this account. So that's authentication, folks. Now, within this topic of authentication design, there's certain things we need to meet. We need to meet the requirements for confidentiality. And with that, we've got three categories. That would have been the CIA triad, which we have spoken about in this course before. So we need to keep credentials secure. That is confidentiality. So if you guys know your CIA triad, you would know confidentiality is to make sure something is for certain people's eyes only. Does not necessarily give you integrity or availability, which is what the I and the A in CIA stands for, but it does mean something is confidential. It's only for certain people's eyes only. So we need to keep credentials secure. We also need to make sure threat actors cannot bypass or subvert the authentication mechanisms, which would be integrity. And then lastly, folks, mechanisms does not cause undue delay or support issues, availability. So it's quite tricky to achieve all three of these. So we need to Basically, find a solution when it comes to proving your identity that meets all three of these categories. That is what the authentication design is. So if I just on my own say authentication, that is just to prove you are who you claim to be. But authentication design basically comes down to the CIA triad, where we need to try and tick all three of these boxes. We need to try and make sure our credentials are secure, but at the same time, we need to make sure that perpetrators, these threat actors, basically the bad guys, that they can bypass whatever mechanism we decide to go and use in the end of the day. And whatever mechanism we do decide to use in the end of the day, keeping in mind we need to try and prevent people from bypassing it, we need to make sure that it doesn't cause an inconvenience or delay things. So you need to be careful about it. So if you look at things like single sign-on is awesome because it gives you availability. People can go and log in very quickly. There's no delay, but it might be a downside if it's not implemented correctly. Some perpetrators, threat actors in other words, they can potentially go and bypass this. So if it's not implemented properly, that can be you or your company's downfall or your client's company's downfall. Now, something I want to just briefly touch on, and we are going to touch on this again later in this specific module, is something you know, the knowledge factor. So you would remember earlier in this video, I mentioned something you know, something you have, and something you are. That's the three most common factors you get. Now, in the factor of something you know, in other words, the knowledge factor, we've got a password. So we all know what a password is. A password is probably the most common form of authentication we get when it comes to something you know. You or the user, they have to provide a password. Generally, you'll find that this password has to meet certain complexity requirements, something we'll go a little bit more deeper into later in this video. But it has to meet certain complexity requirements, like it has to be a minimum of 8 characters these days, or potentially more in some cases. Has to be uppercase, has to be lowercase, has to have numbers and symbols in it. So it's quite tricky these days to get a password chosen. Now, we understand the risks involved and we understand why this has to be done. And since we understand the risks involved and why this is done, it's actually not too difficult for us IT people to go and choose a password. But for the end user that doesn't understand why we are doing this can be quite inconvenient, as you can imagine sometimes. Another example of something you know, besides a password phrase or something, is a PIN, a personal identification number. Now, how you receive this, that's the question. In the old days, it might just be via an SMS, if you guys know what an SMS is. It might potentially still be via an SMS. Although, these days, it's more common to find these via some other method. You might find this via an email. You might receive this via an authentication app, potentially. That is things that you potentially know. Alright, folks, that's just a bit of a brief overview of what that knowledge factor is. More on this later in the video. Cool, I'm going to move you guys on to the topic of password concepts. Yes, I kid you not. So some of the topics in this Security Plus course are going to be easy. Some of them are going to be quite complex, and sometimes it's going to feel like we're going to go ziggity-zag between topics in the sense of difficulty. That's not me, that's the way the course gets presented, folks. So when it comes to password concepts, the first thing you need to know is length. Passwords should ideally not be short, as you can imagine why. The shorter the password is, the easier it is for somebody, a threat actor in other words, to go and crack that password. Whether they're guessing the password, whether they're using some form of software, it's gonna be easier. The longer the password is, the harder it is to get into whatever it is this potentially is. That is why you'll find that most websites and platforms and things these days will limit the user to having a minimum of an 8-character password. You can have a longer password. They don't normally have a limit as to how long the password can be, but normally the minimum length has to be at least 8 characters long. Most websites and platforms these days you'll find has a complexity requirement as well. So if you don't know what that is, it's a character combination. I did mention this earlier with the previous topic. That means you've got to have uppercase letters in there, lowercase letters in there. You've got to have a couple of random numbers in there, symbols, the whole shebang. So it's uppercase, lowercase, numbers and symbols. And then we obviously have the length factor as well. That is just going to make it so much harder for someone or something to crack this password. It doesn't help me much. I've got an 8-character password, but it's an actual word you can potentially find in a dictionary. Then I can go and use something like a dictionary attack against you, if you know what a dictionary attack is. If you don't know what a dictionary attack is, it's a form of software that's going to go and use actual words in the dictionary to try and guess what your password is. Now, fortunately for us, dictionary attacks doesn't work on most websites and platforms and stuff these days, simply because of these complexity requirements we've got now. It forces you or the user to have a couple of random letters and numbers and symbols and stuff in there. So if someone were to go and try and use some form of software that's going to try actual words in the dictionary, guess what? It's not going to work, because people have got random characters and numbers and symbols in their password. So it's very important to have complexity requirements in your passwords as well. What's also important, this is a concept, is aging. So passwords ideally need to expire after a certain period. In other words, you'll find for the average company, the average password for the average user would normally expire after approximately 3 to 6 weeks. So I think the butter zone is approximately 4 weeks for most companies, but it could potentially be less than 4 weeks. It could potentially be more than 4 weeks. We want passwords to expire. Why, do you ask? Well, because if they don't, there is a chance that a friend, a colleague, or somebody not so nice, maybe a threat actor, has seen you or the user's password. And when they saw your password, they could potentially go and use this to get up to nonsense, some form of shenanigans, and we don't want that. Maybe, just maybe, one of the users in your company or your client's company share their password with a colleague or a friend. They do that sometimes. They don't understand the risks involved. And that's bad, as you can imagine. So if that were to be the case, if we make passwords expire, it's not going to help that person for too long. Yes, they might have a password, but very soon after that, the password will cease to function because it's going to expire. So just in case someone happened to have gotten a hold of the password, that's why we make the passwords expire. It's also in the event of somebody or something actively cracking the password in the background, which we call a brute force attack. Now, when it comes to brute force attacks, that simply means someone is trying to guess the password, usually using some form of software, and in most cases they will be using a pretty beefed up machine to do this, usually a supercomputer to go and do this. Now, it takes time to crack a password. Sometimes it just takes days, maybe just a couple of hours, but in most cases it takes a couple of weeks or even a month or so, depending on how beefed up the supercomputer is. Now, if you make the password expire, by the time that supercomputer cracks that password, it would have expired. It might even potentially have expired 2-3 times over, which means they can't get in even if they're cracking the password. So they need to be able to crack the password faster than what it would potentially retire. So they need a lot of processing power, is what we're actually saying here. So aging is a very important one, folks. The fourth one I want to mention to you guys in terms of password concepts is reuse and history. You'll find that most platforms these days do not allow a user to use a password that they've used before. For many reasons, because what if that password has potentially been seen by somebody out there? Somebody, maybe a couple of months ago, even years ago in some cases, they might have known the password, they might have seen the password, and if one of your users has the ability to go and use a previously used password, that's bad. Now, why would the users want to go and do that? Well, guys, remember, the average user does not understand the security risks involved with all of this. They're not in IT, or should I say cybersecurity, like you guys. They are a salesperson, a secretary, an assistant, a doctor, a lawyer. They're in a completely different field than what you are. They've got their own respective fields that they are experts in, and you are the expert in this field. You understand the risks involved in this field. So it's up to us to protect these users basically from themselves, if I have to put it in simple terms. So by preventing these users essentially from using passwords that's been used previously before, we are protecting them from themselves. I know it sounds funky, but that's basically what it comes down to. A lot of users are keen on using passwords they've used in the past because it's easy to remember. If they're going to go and choose a completely new password, it's something they have got to go and remember all over again from scratch, which is quite inconvenient for most of us, even for myself. But if a user can go and use a new password, which is not technically a new password, it's one that they've used a couple of months ago, so they still kind of sort of remember it, it's a lot easier for them to remember it, which is why they're so keen to go and choose previously used passwords. Unfortunately, that's an extremely dangerous thing to do. So most websites and platforms, as soon as the user tries to use a password they've used before, you'll find that by default this is going to be blocked without you even doing anything. This is normally built into most platforms. Now, what some people will go and do in some companies, this is not part of this course, but I'm just throwing it in here for you guys as an extra. Some companies will actually go and implement additional policies on top of this, forcing the user not to be able to use a password that even looks similar to a previously used password. Yes, it's not part of this course, but I'm throwing it in here for you guys as an extra. Now, why do they do that? Because a lot of people, since they've got to meet these complexity requirements and these length requirements, the passwords are not easy to remember. I mean, let's face it, this could be a very complicated random password. And now if you're going to force them to go and get a new one every 3 or 4 weeks, it can be quite difficult for them to remember this password because we keep telling them, don't write the password down anywhere. So yeah, that leaves them with memory. They've got to try and remember this brand spanking new password every 3 or 4 weeks, which is very inconvenient. So what most users do in most companies, in case you guys didn't know, is they'll go and choose the same password, but they'll change one small little aspect about this password. They'll maybe add like a number 1 this first time. And after 3 or 4 weeks when this password expires, they'll change that 1 at the back to a number 2 or a number 3. This is just an example of one small subtle change. It's enough of a change to have this password be recognized as a new password, and yet it still meets the length requirements and the complexity requirements. Now that's very dangerous because if a hacker happens to know what the password originally was, they can go and try and make small little subtle changes like that until they get a bingo. Now that's a problem because most hackers know, these threat actors, they know that most users like to go and make only small subtle changes. Even I know this because I used to do something called penetration testing where I get paid to break into companies legally, of course. Now I would normally try this. If I know what someone's password was and I know it doesn't work anymore, I'll first go and try small little subtle changes at the back of the password, and you wouldn't believe how often I actually got into people's accounts. So there are companies out there, not a lot of them, that'll prevent users from using passwords that look even similar to previously used passwords. So there's benefits to that, there's drawbacks to that. Benefits is, yes, your passwords are way more secure. A drawback to that policy is users are now going to forget their passwords way more often, which results in them harassing your IT team way more often because I forgot my password, as you can imagine. So we want to try and avoid, this whole scenario of reuse in history, but at the end of the day, we do have limitations as to what we can do, and every company is unique in their own certain environment. The last thing I want to mention to you folks under this topic of password concepts is something called NIST guidance. Now, if you folks don't know what NIST stands for, it stands for National Institute of Standards and Technology. You don't need to know what that stands for, it's just something extra I'm throwing in for you guys. So this National Institute of Standards and Technology, this changes from time to time, but it's basically a set of guidelines for us IT people in a sense of things like passwords. What's accepted, or should I say, what is best practice at this exact moment, and what's not a good idea, what you should not go and do. For example, at the moment, you'll find maybe companies are using single sign-on. But in 2 years from now, this NIST might say, guys, please stop using single sign-on because we've got the following new vulnerabilities that's been discovered. Instead, rather go and use this and rather go and use that. So at the moment, what's quite popular amongst many companies, which is recommended by NIST, is passwordless authentication. So that includes, but is not limited to things like FIDO2, FIDO2, if you guys know what that is. A topic that will come up later in the course, not discussed really in this specific module per se, but it is a topic in this course nonetheless. So those are things that's recommended by the National Institute of Technology. Other things that's recommended, just to go and grab at random straws here, is if you look at things like password hints. A lot of websites and computers and platforms these days, they've got some form of password hint these you can go and implement to go and help remind them of what their password is if they can't remember what their password is. Now, this National Institution of Standards and Technology recommends that people do not put the password in the hint. I mean, obvious, you would think that'll be obvious, but you'll be surprised to know how many people will actually go and put the password in the actual hint. Or they'll kind of, give such a hint that it's too informative, if I can put it like that. It actually kind of gives the password away. It might not have the actual password, but it's so informative to the point where it'll actually give the password away to even someone that didn't even know what the password is. So, yeah, they recommend that you be as vague as possible, or the user be as vague as possible if they are going to go and use this. That's just an example of things that's recommended by the institute. Go and Google National Institute of Standards Technology guidelines. So go and Google it like that, the whole word, and then just follow with the word guidelines. And you'll find it's going to give you the current guidelines. I think the last time it was updated was in August 2024, the last time I checked. I stand to be corrected. But you'll find ever so often they'll go and update it. They'll go and remove things which were accepted, and they'll go and add new things which are now considered accepted. Feel free to go and check it out, folks. Alright, folks, let's move you on to the third topic in this section, password managers. I think a lot of you guys probably have a very good idea of what I'm about to explain here. So these password managers, they actually do come with most computers already. So if you look at something like Windows has got something built into it called password credentials or credential manager in some cases. So instead of you having to go and remember a whole boatload of passwords, which is quite difficult sometimes, you just need to remember one password. We call this the vault or the master password. So that is the password to your password manager. And this password manager, whatever kind of password manager you use, it will in turn store all your other passwords. So basically, considering that there's one password that protects all your other passwords, that main password needs to obviously be your most secure password. That's probably your most important password, because if I have that password, I essentially have all your passwords. So these password managers, yes, they can be built into other things like your operating system. So you get built into the operating system, and you get browser password managers. So if you go to a website, this could be social media, it can be your banking, it can be anything. You'll find that very often your browser will ask you, do you want your browser to remember this password? And if you go to a website, your browser will automatically sometimes fill in the password for you, or ask you if it can fill in the password automatically for you. So this does give you a massive sense of convenience in that sense. It is very dangerous though, because if a perpetrator, a threat actor, gets a hold of this main password of yours, the vault or master password as it's referred to sometimes, they effectively have the password to everything of yours. Now, why is it such a good idea though to use a password manager? Well, guys, like I said earlier, so many people have so many passwords, and due to people, including myself and you, having so freaking many passwords, what a lot of these people tend to do then to help them remember these passwords, besides password managers, is they tend to use the same password or nearly the same password. Usually it is the same password. So whether it be their social media like Facebook or the platform called X or Instagram, or whether it be their banking or whatever, maybe their company websites, a lot of people will go and use the same password for multiple platforms and multiple softwares. That's a very bad thing to go and do, folks. Even if you've got a secure password, using the same password for multiple things is always a bad idea. Because if I am that threat actor now, and I manage to somehow get a hold of this password, whether it be cracking it or whatever, I effectively have access to everything now. That is very dangerous. So if you go look at something like Google's Gmail platform, very unsecure. I mean, it's gotten a lot more secure over the years now, but it is generally seen as one of the easier platforms to break into. Now, if you have a password on your Gmail, which is generally not too difficult to break into, and you use that same password on your banking, now your banking is obviously very secure. I probably can't break in there, but I can break into your Gmail. And if I get your password in your Gmail, chances are pretty good you're using that same password for your banking now. So you see what you're doing here? You're putting yourself at risk. Do not use the same password for multiple things. Now, me saying that makes it quite difficult, because how the heck do you remember all these passwords? Especially if you look at the previous topics where we said we need to meet a minimum length, complexity requirements, and these passwords are going to expire. How do I expect you to remember all these passwords? Well, the fact of the matter, folks, is you don't need to remember these passwords. You just need to remember one password. Your vault password, or should I say your master password. That is the password to your password manager. As I've said earlier, this could be built into your browser. This could be built into your operating system. Heck, folks, you can even go and download a third-party password manager if you really want to. And if it's a third-party password manager, just take note, these third-party cloud password managers, they sometimes, they involve a plugin that might need to be installed in your browser first. So at first glance, they might not work. Maybe you just installed it, But if you go to your browser, it might not necessarily pop up automatically. You might need to go and install a plugin first before it'll go and work. I normally don't use third-party password managers simply because it's too inconvenient for me. But I'm just mentioning it to you folks as well. If you decide to go and use a third party for whatever reason, there's a very good chance you might need to go and install a plugin on your browser first before you can actually go and use it. Now, what's also pretty cool about these password managers is if your password for something expires, whether it be a program, a website, or just in general, when you need to go and choose a password, your very first password for something, the password manager actually generates your password. It'll give you a totally random generated password, which is very secure. It meets all these complexity requirements. And if it does not, you just fill in what requirements you want. I want an 8-character password, or I want a 10-character password. It needs to have this, it needs to have that. And the password generator will follow those instructions and generate you a password that meets those requirements. It won't just generate you a password, it'll automatically store that password for you. How convenient is that? So there's not really any downsides to these password managers. The only real downside is if someone happens to get a hold of your master password, which is very unlikely, since it's only one password you have to remember, you can probably go and afford to make it a little bit more secure. I would say don't just make it 8 characters, make it 10 characters, or maybe make it 12 characters, since that's the main password. I mean, folks, this is the only password you can have to remember then. So you might as well put in a little bit extra effort and make it extra tippy-toe secure. Why not? I mean, it's only one password you've got to remember now, right? Another downside about password managers is sometimes some of these password managers work in the cloud. And if the cloud gets compromised, which is very unlikely, then your password manager is compromised. Also, if you visit a website that's spoofing, a website that is pretending to be another legitimate website, that could potentially be a problem. Normally, it's not a problem because when you go to a website that asks for credentials, your password manager will check the certificate of that website. Something we discussed in Module 3 on this course already. So if you guys don't know what a certificate is, or if you don't remember what it is, please go and check in Module 3. There is timestamps in each video, so just go and check specifically for that timestamp in Module 3 about certificates for websites. So a certificate is normally issued by a certificate authority. It proves that this website is legit, that it is who or what it claims to be. So if this website claims to be facebook.com, how does your password manager know that this really is facebook.com? It's gonna look at the certificate of this website that claims to be Facebook. And if the certificate checks out, because it was issued by a well-known certificate authority like GoDaddy as an example, then we know Facebook is legit and it's gonna allow your password to be entered. But if the certificate is missing or it does not check out, your password manager will not enter your password automatically, which is what we want. So it doesn't just store your password securely, it also checks for certificates for you in the background. I mean, how awesome is that, guys? So yes, password managers have got secure filing. Usually this will be locally. Sometimes some of these password managers unfortunately only store your passwords locally on your machine. Some of them only store it in the cloud, some of them do it both ways. At the end of the day, no password manager or no form of security will ever guarantee you 100% security. But what I can tell you folks is a password manager is probably one of the most secure ways you can go in a sense of managing all your passwords. So even if you have a folder on your PC that's got your passwords on it and it's encrypted, that's pretty good. I mean, that's very secure, but it's not as secure as a password manager, folks. Alright folks, let's move on to the next topic, multi-factor authentication. Now funny enough, we did kind of sort of cover this topic already in the earlier topics, at least we did so indirectly. So I did briefly explain to you guys earlier what authentication is, just authentication on its own. That is the concept of proving you are who you claim to be or what you claim to be. This can be done in many ways, many categories. Each of these categories is referred to as a factor, hence the name multi-factor. Now, multi-factor authentication, guys, simply means the user has to prove they are who they claim to be in more than one category, more than one factor. Now, the first factor, or should I say category, which is the most commonly used one, is something you know, something we did explain earlier. Something you know is normally something like a password most commonly, but this could potentially also be something like a PIN, it could be a phrase, or a password phrase. So this is a category or it's a factor. A second factor or category would be something you have, something you possess on your person. This can be something like a bank card, a smart card, a thumb, a fob. This could even be a mobile device, because like I said earlier in this lesson, a mobile device would normally receive a one-time PIN, or there's some sort of authenticating app on it. That's why we say it's something you possess, something you have. A third category or factor would be something you do or something you are. So starting off something you are, that's normally biometric in nature. Something like a fingerprint scan, facial recognition, voice recognition, retina eye scan, that kind of stuff. So the three most common categories and the three most widely used categories is something you know, something you have, and something you are. But it could potentially be other categories as well. There are other ones out there. It could also be something that you're doing. Now, that is quite rare in most cases, but you do find those. So, if you guys have ever seen a good action episode or an action movie, maybe like a Mission Impossible movie, and you see Tom Cruise doing some funky stuff to break into some sort of facility, that is usually something you do. This could involve walking a certain way or something along those lines. Quite rare, but it is out there, guys. It's not just fantasy, it does exist. Now, fourth category I want to throw into the mix here for you guys, just to mix things up, is somewhere you are. This used to always be there. People just didn't really use it that much. Nowadays, you'll find a lot of platforms use this, especially the cloud. So somewhere you are is normally a form of geographic lock. You or the user have to geographically be in a certain location before you can log into a certain device or a certain platform or a certain account. This is usually based on public IP address. I'm not saying it's limited to that, but it's usually based on your public IP address. So what companies might do is they will force the user to be at the office. If they grab their company laptop and they go home and they've got the username and password, they might not necessarily be able to log in because the system they're trying to log into will detect that they're logging in from somewhere else. They've got to log in from a specific location which has been specified by the organization. So that could be an additional factor when it comes to authentication to prove you are who you claim to be. So if a perpetrator from outside the company tries to log in, they'll probably not be able to log in because, well, we're outside the company. You've got to be inside the company just to prove you are indeed an employee. Obviously, like any form of authentication or any form of security, it's not foolproof. I mean, a perpetrator or a threat actor can always wiggle their way into the company and pretend to be a guest and then plug themselves in somewhere, and then voila, they're logging in from somewhere you are. So it's not foolproof, but it is going to make it harder for these people, and at least we're not going to be handing it to them on a silver platter. Alright, and then folks, I want to talk to you guys about hard authentication tokens. And right after that, we're going to be talking about soft authentication tokens. So you can probably guess this is a way or a means for you or the user to prove their identity once again. Because let's face it, that's pretty much what this module is about authentication. I mean, that's what the whole module says. It says it in the name. So this topic of hard authentication tokens, folks, an ownership factor means that the user possesses some type of device that only they can operate. This is referred to as an authenticator. The authenticator is able to generate or receive a token that identifies and authenticates the user. There are three main types of token generation we get. I'm going to mention three of them for you guys here. The first one you get is certificate-based authentication. Feel free to go and read up about that if you guys want to. But it basically comes down to it is when the supplicant controls a private key that can generate a unique signed token. A second one you get is one-time password. In other words, an OTP. Good old-fashioned OTP, folks. So this is when a token is generated using some sort of hash function on a shared secret value plus a synchronization seed, such as a timestamp or, that kinds of stuff. The third one I want to mention to you folks is FIDO2. Yep, FIDO2, something I mentioned to you guys earlier. So this is basically an example of passwordless authentication. I don't need a password. It's a token of sorts that gets generated in some form of way. Now, folks, in a sense of authentication form factors, so in what shape or form can this authentication take place in? Well, a hard authentication, folks, is generated within a secure crypto processor, if that makes any sense. The authentication design means that there is no transmission of the token itself. Several device-based authenticators can be used to implement hard tokens, guys. Now, if you're not sure what these devices are, let me give you guys a couple of examples. The first one is smart cards. Visually at first glance, these will probably look like a bank card or something like that, but it's not a bank card. Some of them might literally just be white. They might look blank, and you've got to bring them near a sensor of some kind before they'll detect something. They work with a wireless signal to a certain extent. But usually a smart card requires some form of special smart card reader. So this is very expensive to go and implement, guys. Don't get me wrong. It's awesome, the security, but it's going to cost you. Something else you get is a one-time password once again, OTP. So this refers to a crypto processor that can generate a token. This type of hardware token does not need an interface to connect with a computer, folks. The user just reads the code that's displayed, obviously. And then the third one, guys, security key. This refers to a portable hardware security module, which we sometimes refer to as a HSM for short, with a computer interface, and this will normally be something like a USB or NFC, those kinds of ones. Alright, and then folks, I'm going to move you on to soft authentication tokens. Yep, so we spoke about hard authentication tokens, now we're moving on to something called soft authentication tokens. Now this is actually the more common one out of the two, so you might not realize it, but this is the one that we've been using, well, most of us have been using most of the time. So if you don't know what this is, a soft authentication token, folks, is a one-time password which is generated by the identity provider and transmitted to you or the user. In other words, we are going to go and transmit this as a code via some sort of out-of-bound channel. This can be sent to you or the user via SMS, which some of you guys might know as a text message. This could be sent to you in an email, which is a little bit more common these days. SMS is actually falling away. This could be a phone call, which is pretty cool. So some of these providers will actually phone you. You'll find this is normally going to be some robot that's going to phone you. Or, this is also pretty common these days, some form of push notifications. You've got some form of app installed, not necessarily an authenticator app, and this app, or whatever it might be, will give you some sort of code that's going to pop up on the app. Now, if you are concerned about security, which you probably should be, and you've got a very good reason for being concerned about security, you can go and use a little bit more of a secure option. Not sure if you guys have noticed, but places or entities like the banks, they don't just use your old school OTPs anymore. Many moons ago, well actually not so many moons ago, if you did banking online and you wanted to do some sort of transfer or payment, the bank would normally send you an OTP in the form of a text message to your phone, and you would have to enter that on your computer or whatever, and then the transaction can be complete. Nowadays, this is not the case because OTPs are no longer as secure as they used to be. At least not in the sense of SMSs, in other words, text messages, and also not so much in emails, because email addresses can be compromised and phones can be compromised because everybody has a smartphone these days. A smartphone is basically a computer, which means it can be compromised. A couple of years ago, 10, 15, 20 years ago, people did not have smartphones, so OTPs received via text message was obviously way more secure back in the day. So if you are concerned about security, which you should be, you can go and use an authenticator app. Something like the Microsoft Authenticator app or like the Google Authenticator app. There's quite a few other third-party ones as well. And you'll find that most banks these days have their own banking app that you can go and install as well. Most of these banks will probably force you to go and actually install their banking app. And if you want to go and do banking, if you want to go and do some sort of transfer or payment or whatever, you got to go and acknowledge something on the app now, which is going to be basically the replacement for the old OTP. So this is a more secure soft OTP token, which can be generated using an authenticator app. A lot of companies will go and use this these days, guys. You'll find that most organizations, if you want to log into your 365, in other words, your Outlook, your Microsoft Teams, your whatever, it's going to ask you to go and authenticate on some sort of app these days instead of just typing in your traditional password and blah, blah, blah. So this is software which is installed on a computer or a smartphone, probably on your smartphone. The user must register each identity provider with the app, typically using a scannable quick response code, which we call QR codes for short. This is to communicate the shared secret key. When prompted to authenticate, that's going to prompt you or the user to go and authenticate, the user must unlock the Authenticator app with their device credentials. So if it's a smartphone, you're going to go and unlock the smartphone of yours the old school way by drawing your pattern, entering your PIN, or using your fingerprint. And then the user must unlock the Authenticator app with the device credentials to view the OTP token. There's obviously way less risk of interception, if you go and compare this to something like an SMS or an email message. But as it runs on a shared use device, there is of course the possibility that malware could go and compromise the app. There's always going to be the possibility that malware can go and compromise it. Unfortunately, folks, like I said earlier in this video, anything can be compromised these days. All we want to achieve is to make it so darn gosh difficult for the perpetrators to the point where they'll hopefully give up or say, you know what, let's just move on to the next person. That's all we want to achieve here. But all in all, the possibility for interception on some sort of authenticator app like the Microsoft Authenticator app or the Google Authenticator app or your bank's Authenticator app, all in all, the possibility is way less because it's way harder. It's way more difficult to go and achieve that, guys. So we don't want to go and give this to the perpetrators on a silver platter. So yeah, if you can avoid it, try and avoid using a traditional email to send you an OTP and try and avoid your traditional text message to send you an OTP. I mean, it's definitely a form of security. That's great. It's better than having no security. But if you can, try and get yourself better security is what we're saying. Alright, and then folks, I'm going to move you on to the last topic in this specific section. That would be passwordless authentication. And depending on how much you paid attention earlier in this video, you would have heard me mention things like FIDO2. FIDO2 is just one example of passwordless authentication. Now, it's very difficult for someone to go and crack something like a password if, well, there is no password. I mean, yes, a longer password and a more complex password is obviously a lot more secure. But what if you or the user just don't use a password? You use something that might be in your possession. Now, I'm not saying it's foolproof. It doesn't mean that it can't be compromised, but it is a lot harder to go and compromise, obviously, which is what we want to achieve here. And it's probably not going to be too long before the perpetrators, the threat actors, figures another way around this, and then we'll have to come up with some form of new security again. So it's a constant battle between the white hat hackers and the black hat hackers, as you guys know. So folks, passwordless authentication relies on an authenticator rather than a password. Accounts are verified by public and private key pair, but does not have to use PKI, in other words, public key infrastructure. Your private key in this situation, folks, that is stored only on the authenticator. Pretty secure, wouldn't you guys say? I mean, if you go look at something like the Microsoft Authenticator app, very secure. Now, the authenticator, folks, can require something like biometrics, like a fingerprint scan or something along those lines, or a PIN as proof of presence. This could be a local gesture, for example. And then lastly, folks, something I want to mention under this topic before we move on to the next section, that would be attestation. I'm probably butchering the name. I'm trying my best here, but as you guys probably know by now, my first language is not English. So yeah, I tend to butcher somebody's name. I'm going to try again. Attestation, I think is how you pronounce that. So that is for a passwordless system to be secure. The authenticator, folks, must be trusted and resistant to things like spoofing or cloning attacks. Now, attestation is a mechanism for an authenticated device such as FIDO security key or the TPM in a PC or laptop to prove that it is a root of trust. Each security key is manufactured with an attestation and model ID. During the registration step, if the relying party requires attestation, the authenticator uses the key to send a report. The relying party can check the attestation report to verify that the authenticator is a known brand and model and supports whatever cryptographic properties the relying party demands. Now folks, something worth noting here just before we move on, the attestation key is not unique, guys. If it were unique, it would be very easy to go and identify individuals and be a serious threat to privacy. Instead, it identifies a particular brand and model. That's basically what it does. Alright folks, I think we can finally move on to the second main section in this module, which is access management. Alright folks, the first topic up in this second section is discretionary and mandatory access control. And with this, the first thing I want to mention to you guys is access control model. So for those of you that don't know, the access control model that determines how users receive permissions and or rights. So we can say a user account that has been authenticated can be allocated rights and permissions on networks, computers, and data. An access control model, folks, simply describes the principles that govern how your users receive their rights. That's all it is. Now, if we look at something like discretionary access control, this, folks, is based on the primacy of the resource owner. So in a DAC model, in other words, discretionary access control model, every resource has an owner. The owner creates a file or service, although the ownership can be assigned to any user. The owner has full control over the resource and they can modify its access control list to grant rights to other users. So if we say access control list, guys, we normally refer to this as an ACL for short. Now this discretionary access control, folks, is the most flexible model and it's currently implemented widely in computer and network security. In file system security, it's the model used by default, in case you guys didn't know. And this is for most Unix, Linux distributions, and even Microsoft Windows. As the most flexible model, it is also the weakest because it makes centralized administration of security policies the most difficult to enforce. It is also unfortunately the easiest to compromise as it's vulnerable to insider threats and abuse of compromised accounts, unfortunately. Now, if you look at something like mandatory access control, folks, the DAC model, which we spoke of earlier, that exposes information to the threat of compromise via the privileged owner accounts. Now, the mandatory access control is based on security clearance levels. Rather than defining access control lists on resources, each object is given a classification level and each subject is granted a clearance level. In a confidentiality-oriented multi-level system, subjects are permitted to read objects classified at their own clearance level or below, obviously not above. For example, a user with top security clearance could read data with top secret, secret, and confidential classification labels. A user with secret clearance could access secret and confidential levels only. Obviously nothing above that, which would be top secret clearance. Labeling objects and granting clearance takes place using pre-established rules, folks. The critical point is that these rules are non-discretionary and cannot be changed by any subject account. So when it comes to choosing between these two, I can't tell you guys, hey, you must go and use DAC or you must go and use MAC. At the end of the day, I suppose it's going to come down to your company's unique requirements and needs or that of your client. But generally, the MAC is seen as the little bit more secure one. But it doesn't mean that's the one that's going to be working for your unique environment. Maybe in your environment, security is not that much of a concern. And maybe DAC is going to work a little bit better in your environment. So at the end of the day, you're going to have to go and put this on a scale and check which one's going to work better for your specific needs. Alright folks, I'm going to move you on to the next topic in this section. That is role-based and attribute-based access control. So it's also a form of access control. This time we're going to be talking about role-based and attribute-based access control. So starting you folks off with role-based access control. This is generally referred to as RBAC for short. Be careful of the abbreviation, folks. That's normally how they like to refer to it in the exam. So they will not necessarily say role-based access control in the exam if they ask you a question or if they list this as a possible answer. Instead, it will be referred to as RBAC.
And the same can be said about attribute-based access control. Once we get to that, that'll be ABAC. So ABAC is obviously for attribute access control. So that's how they will be referring to that in the exam. So make sure you are very familiar with these abbreviations. Otherwise, they might end up asking you a very simple question and you're not going to know what they're asking of you simply because you don't remember what the abbreviation stands for. It is role-based access control, folks. It is a non-discretionary and more centralized control. So a very good example of this would probably be something like Microsoft 365, Azure's Active Directory, which they refer to as Microsoft Entra ID now. So if you go there, you'll find that you can actually go and allocate role-based access control to a user. So this role-based access control, folks, it means that an organization defines its permission requirements in terms of the tasks that an employee or a service must be able to perform. Each set of permissions is a role. Each principal, user or service account, is allocated to one or more roles. So if you guys happen to have ever played on Microsoft 365 or the Azure portal, if you go to Entra ID, you will find that each of these roles that you can go and allocate to a user's account, these are tick boxes. They're not radio buttons. You can go and allocate multiple roles to a person's account, depending on what he or she needs to be able to do. Now, under this system, the right to modify the permissions assigned to each role is reserved to a system owner, folks. Therefore, the system is non-discretionary as each principal cannot modify the access control list of a resource even though they can change the resource in other ways. Now, principals, folks, gain rights implicitly through being assigned to a role rather than explicitly being assigned the right directly. So that all in mind, this role-based access control, folks, it is based on defining roles then allocating users to roles. So we're going to be defining roles to users and we're not going to be allocating users to roles. It's not how it works. Users should only inherit role permissions to perform particular tasks. That's the only time this should happen. Then we also get something called security groups. This is very popular in companies these days, especially amongst the cloud. So a security group, as you can see in the name, it's obviously a type of group. Now this is a way or a means to make your work a little bit easier and a little bit lighter. Typical from Microsoft. So instead of you having to go to each and every user account to go and assign some sort of role or permission or something, instead you can go and assign the permissions and the roles and the what have you to a security group. And then later down the line, you simply just go and chuck these people into the security group, and they're obviously going to automatically inherit the permissions that comes with that specific group. So that's normally how it's done. So if security groups, you assign permissions to security groups and assign user accounts to the relevant security groups. Now, before you ask in the comment section down below, yes, somebody can be in more than one security group. And in case you guys didn't know, a security group is in fact the most common kind of group you can find in environments like Microsoft 365. I used to always think it's the Microsoft 365 groups which is the most common one. I mean, it's kind of in the name, but it turns out it's not. Security groups is the most common kind of group you can get. So if you need to assign some sort of permission or policy to a group of users, simply go and create yourself a security group. You can call this whatever you want. You can call this security group Banana if you want to. And you go and chuck all the relevant people into that group, and they will automatically have the relevant permissions that you need. And in case you guys didn't know, also with regards to security groups, groups can be mapped to roles. It is possible that groups can be mapped to roles in case you need to go and do that. And before we close this topic, guys, as for attribute-based access control, like I said earlier, this is referred to as ABAC for short. Now, with attribute access control, access decisions are based on a combination of subject and object attributes, plus any context-sensitive or system-wide attributes. Now, attribute-based access control, folks, this is the most fine-grained type of access control model you can find. As the name suggests, an attribute access control system makes its access decisions based on a combination of subject and object attributes plus any context-sensitive or system-wide attributes like I said earlier. Now, folks, as well as group or role memberships, these attributes could include information about the operating system currently being used. This could include information about the IP address or the presence of up-to-date patches, and anti-malware, that kind of stuff. An attribute system, folks, monitors the number of events or alerts attributed with a user account or with a resource, or tracks access requests to ensure that they are consistent in terms of timing or geographic location. It can be programmed to implement policies such as M of N control and separation of duties if need be. And of course, much more. But that should give you guys a more or less idea of what attribute access control consists of. Alright, folks, let's move on to another type of access control we get, rule-based access control. So I suppose we could say non-discretionary access control. More on that in just a moment. So rule-based access control, folks, this refers to any sort of access control model where access control policies are determined by system-enforced rules rather than by system users. Now, with that in mind, folks, if you look at things like role-based access control, attribute access control, and even mandatory access control, in other words, RBAC, ABAC, and MAAC, these are all examples of rule-based, or should I say, non-discretionary access control, folks. Now, if you look at something like conditional access, this is something you folks will find in a lot of places. Most commonly, people and companies will go and use this on platforms like Microsoft 365 and obviously Microsoft Azure. Now, these days, with so many folks working remotely and working from places that's not necessarily the office, there's absolutely a need for things like conditional access. So these are normally conditions that has to be met before the user will be granted access to a certain resource. This can be any amount of conditions. This could be conditions like the user has to use a Windows operating system, or the user has to use an Android or iOS operating system. This could possibly be conditions like the user has to have a certain build or a certain edition of Windows. This could be certain things like the user has to have complexity of their password or a certain length of their password. This could be requirements like the user has to have BitLocker encryption on the device. Heck, guys, this can even be a geographic lock, which means the user has to be geographically speaking in a certain location before they'll be granted access to certain resources. This is most commonly based on public IP address, but more recently Microsoft has also added GPS location to the mix there, so it's gotten quite interesting. Now, for conditional access, folks, this is an example of rule-based access control. A conditional access system monitors account or device behavior throughout a session. If certain conditions are met, the session can either be, disconnected. So maybe this person was meeting the requirements and now they no longer do. So the session will be broken. It's going to break the session. If the user did not meet the requirements and now they suddenly do, then they will be able to establish a session. Sometimes it's the other way around. If you look at something like user account control, which we refer to as UAC, this is a benefit or a function that came out on Windows Vista in 2008, for those of you that don't know. So things like UAC and sudo restrictions on privileged accounts are examples of conditional access. That's just one example. You get many kinds of conditional access on many platforms. The user is prompted for confirmation or authentication when making requests that require elevated privileges. So I suppose if you look at the classic old school situation of administrator accounts and standard user accounts, so if you try and change something on a system that requires an admin to do that, it's going to pop up with a prompt and say, are you sure you want to do this? So if you're an admin that's logged in, it's just going to ask you if you're sure you want to change this system setting. If you're not an administrator, it's going to pop up and say, please ask the credentials of an administrator, or please provide credentials of an administrator. That's just to make sure you're authorized to do this. That, folks, is also an example of conditional access, believe it or not. And then, folks, another topic I want to take you to is something called least privilege permission assignments. Now, the chances are most of you guys already know what this is without me even having to explain that. So least privilege is a golden rule in IT. It's not just a rule in this course. It's not just a rule in Microsoft. It's a golden rule in IT in general. All IT personnel live and abide by this rule. So the principle of least privilege, folks, simply comes down to sufficient permissions only. It means you don't give someone or something more permissions or privilege than what they need to achieve a task or a goal. And this includes even yourself. Why yourself, you ask? Well, guys, what if your account gets compromised one day? It's not if, but when your account gets compromised one day, because let's face it, it is gonna happen. Now, when your account gets compromised, if you were logged in with the main administrator account, that can be very severe. That perpetrator, in other words, that threat actor, will have a severe level of access and they can do a lot of damage. So if you were using a normal user account or a very limited IT admin account to do your day-to-day tasks, we're not saying this threat actor won't be able to see stuff and won't be able to do stuff, but we are limiting what they can see and do. That is the same reason when it comes to your users. So when we give them least privilege, it's not just in case their account gets compromised, it's also in the event of one of these users possibly going rogue. They might be a spy, they might go rogue, in other words, it's going to become a disgruntled employee. And when they become disgruntled for whatever apparent reason, we want to limit what they can see and what damage they can possibly go and do. Now, obviously, with least privilege, there's a couple of implications with that. Now, the implications, folks, is sometimes some of your users, especially your administrators, may or may not have insufficient permissions. I cannot tell you how many times I've had this, especially with Microsoft, especially in the cloud. So as an example, let's say I hire you to be my main administrator on Microsoft Teams. So anything related to Microsoft Teams, you are the go-to guy. You've got full outright permissions on the Microsoft Teams Admin Center, if you guys are familiar with that. Now, even though I give you full permissions on that, believe it or not all the settings and configurations are going to be on a Teams Admin Center. Some of them are going to be on a SharePoint Admin Center. So this person will now need some permissions on SharePoint. Some of these permissions and settings or configurations are going to be on the 365 main admin center. And some of them will even be on the Microsoft Azure portal. Now this becomes quite a bit of a pickle because now I need to go and give this person permissions on SharePoint. I need to give this individual permissions on the 365 admin center. And I need to go and give this person permissions on the Azure portal. So there's going to be cases, well, actually a lot of cases, let's not lie about this, where the person will not have sufficient permissions. It's massive growing pains. It's going to take days, weeks, or months to go and fine-tune it, which is why it's such a mission if one of these persons resigns and now somebody else has to go and take over. Another implication, guys, is authorization creep. Now, in the beginning, when you just manage to figure out someone's account and you finally kind of like narrow down to what permissions they need, as time goes by, this person might from time to time need to go and do other things outside the scope of their normal duties. And with that in mind, you may or may not need to give them extra additional permissions over and above the normal permissions they have. This is normally going to be temporary. Now, sometimes these permissions will go and disappear automatically depending on how you assigned it and via what you assigned it. So if you're using something like privileged identity management, for those of you who know what that is, the permissions can automatically fall away. If you're using something like a guest account on Microsoft Azure, the permissions can also possibly fall automatically away. There's lots of things on 365, especially on Microsoft Azure, that you can go and use to make someone's privilege and permissions fall away automatically after they've done certain tasks or after a certain period. But not all companies use that. In a lot of cases, in a lot of companies, till this day, administrators like me and you might sometimes still have to go and manually remove the permissions someone has. Now, sometimes we forget. I don't know about you guys, but when the missus asks me to go and buy milk and bread, after work, I'm probably going to forget to go and do that. So if I can't even remember to go and do that, how am I going to remember to go and revoke someone's permissions if it's been a couple of days, weeks, or months? I'm not going to remember that. Even if I put a reminder on my phone or something, maybe when this reminder goes off, I'm busy that particular moment, and then it just escapes from me. I just forget about it. It's a problem. Now, when these people get that extra permissions, a little bit here, a little bit there, extra permission this week, and extra permission next month, that, folks, is referred to as authorization creep. So, slowly but surely, this individual, or individuals, might be more than one person, they're slowly but surely going to gain more access and more access and more privilege and more privilege. Doesn't happen often, but there are companies where this does happen. Now, to help avoid this, there's a need for auditing. How you do this, when you do this, is up to you. I would suggest you do this as often as possible, at least once a week, at the very, very least once a month. You or somebody, maybe even an outsider, has to go and check what level of permissions or privilege somebody has. There's multiple things you guys can go and use for this. You can go and look at something like access reviews, not really part of this course per se, but access reviews in Microsoft is something you can go and use, where people can go and review their own permissions. It is something that you can go and use to go and review people's permissions as well. This can happen once a week, once a month. The system will automatically send you a reminder. It's going to say, hey, you need to go and review the privilege and permissions of the following individuals. You can go and check it. And depending on what you find, you can go and report it, and some of these actions can be taken care of automatically. Some of them will not be happening automatically. It might be forwarded to an administrator, such as yourself, and you will have to investigate further, and you will have to go and do the necessary actions. So auditing is an absolute must. It allows you to go and just double check if everybody still has the privilege that they need, and maybe not too much.
All right, folks, next up, we've got the topic of user account provisioning. Now, if you don't know what provisioning itself is, this is simply the process of setting up a service according to a standard procedure or according to best practice checklist that you might have. Now, the IT department, in other words you must keep track of all assets under management. This includes things like user accounts, obviously, because user accounts, folks, is seen as a type of asset. And considering the title is about user account provisioning, we can probably guess that this is going to be about user accounts. And when it comes to provisioning user accounts, guys, this involves creating the account in a nutshell. But it's a little bit more than just that. So sometimes it's not as simple as, hey, let's just go and choose a username and a password. No. In some medium to large size companies, it's a little bit more than just doing that. So in some companies, you may or may not need to go and do something called identity proofing. If you don't know what this is basically where this user who we're creating the account for, where they verify that they are who they say they are, especially if it's someone outside your company. And if it's someone inside your company, you probably know the person, but we still need some form of formal documentation, blah, blah, blah. But if we're working with consultants, contractors outside our company that we need to go and create an account for, probably a temporary account for, we would probably like some sort of proof that they are who they claim to be, so that if poop hits the fan, we know who to contact afterwards. So in other words, certain circumstances might also demand a background check. So this person claims to be from some sort of construction company or some IT company or medical company. We might need to go and do some sort of background check just to check out if they really are who they claim to be, to go and check their credentials. So this includes, but it's not limited to, things like checking their previous addresses, maybe their education if they claim to have certain certifications or qualifications, maybe their previous employment, check if they've got a criminal record, that kinds of mumbo jumbo. Something else that is sometimes included in account provisioning is the issuing of credentials. Now, this one is more common. The identity proofing doesn't always take place. It depends on the circumstances. But issuing of credentials is generally going to take place, guys. So this allows the user to usually select a password that is only known to them. And if need be, it also enrolls them with some sort of biometric or maybe some sort of token-based authenticator. So if they're going to be using biometrics or tokens, then you might need to go and do this. It depends. I've seen some companies will go and choose a random password. Maybe it's the company's name followed by @123. And then once the person logs in for the first time on this account to this asset, they get to go and choose their password then. Then you get other companies where they'll let you go and choose the password up front, which is more what this situation is all about. Something else that is included in account provisioning, which is also pretty common for most companies, is the issuing of hardware and software assets. So if you go look at the average company, they'll normally go and issue a user with something like a laptop, possibly a phone or a tablet, and in some cases, some rare cases, maybe a smart card reader or external drives, all kinds of weird mumbo jumbo like that. And I've seen in some rare cases, they might even issue the person with a router. I suppose it depends on the country you're in. Maybe you'll pronounce this as router. But they'll issue this person with a router or a router, maybe a SIM card or a dongle. Now, if you're not going to go and do that, I'm not saying you have to. Most companies will go and do this because it allows them to go and control this asset and set rules for this asset since it belongs to them as the company. But if you're not going to go and do that because you're a cheapskate or something, you risk the chance of these people obtaining their own hardware. And if they're going to do that, folks, is seen as shadow IT. Shadow IT is when people bring their own hardware to the office. This could be their own laptop, their own router. And if they bring their own assets, which I suppose you can also call BYOD, except it's unauthorized. Usually when it's unauthorized, we call it shadow IT. It's stuff we don't know about. If it's stuff we do know about and we've allowed it, we just call it BYOD. In other words, bring your own device.
But if it's stuff they're bringing in, basically sneaking into the company that we don't know about, that is shadow IT. And it's a huge concern for companies because now that asset is probably not secured. If we don't know about it, we can't go and enforce security on it. We can't tell the user how dangerous this might be, which is why it's usually in a company's interest to go and issue the users with some sort of asset like a laptop, desktop, or something. And then normally you can go and enroll it into something like Intune. You can go and drop a little setup file on there for Configuration Manager. The point is you can go and manage this device, and then you can go and put some sort of AUP policy on there, which is basically short for Acceptable Usage Policy, which says what they're allowed to use this asset for and what they're not allowed to go and use this asset for. Then, what is also included in the provisioning process is teaching policy awareness. So in other words, you need to go and train these users, these staff members, or whoever they might be, on the policies your company has, especially the security policies, what they should do and what they should not do. This includes, but is not limited to, things like what to go and do with a laptop. So if they are using a laptop that belongs to the company, you might tell them, sir, ma'am, don't use this laptop for personal games. Don't use this laptop for social media. Don't use this laptop to go and do personal downloads, because you're going to compromise this laptop, and that puts the company's data and resources at risk. So it includes things like that, but it's not limited to things like that. And then lastly, folks, in the provisioning process, you've also got something called creating permissions assignment. Now, this, folks, this is identifying the work roles that the account must support and configuring the appropriate rights using a role-based, mandatory, or attribute-based access control model. So you can use either of those ones I've just mentioned. If the account is granted privileged access, it should be tagged for close monitoring, of course. So we've got a fairly good idea now, I think, of what provisioning is. Like I said in the beginning, it's basically just creating an account, but there might be T's and C's to that, linked to that. So it's not always as simple as just creating an account, choosing username, choosing an email address, choosing a password. There might be a little bit extra involved there. Now, sometimes we need to go and do the exact opposite, folks, which is called deprovisioning. Now, if I'm saying opposite, you can probably guess what that means. It means to go and delete the account or get rid of it in simple terms. So deprovisioning, folks, is the process of removing the access rights and permissions allocated to an employee when they leave the company for whatever reason that might be. This could be because it's an employee that's been working there and he or she has resigned, they got retrenched, they got fired, in other words, they got let go. Maybe they aged out, I don't know. It could be maybe they passed away, unfortunately. There's also cases where it might just be a contractor or a consultant and whatever they were working on has come to an end. And if they come to an end, we don't want that account just lying around on our system, because that's referred to as a Smurf account. And a Smurf account is one of the biggest targets for threat actors. A Smurf account is a dormant account in a nutshell, which means it's not being used. And if it's not being used, it's not always being as closely monitored. In some cases, in some companies, it's not being monitored at all. It's a huge security risk. So ideally, as quickly as possible, you want to go and disable this account, and as quickly as possible, you want to go and delete the account. We don't always delete these accounts immediately, because sometimes we do need to temporarily log in as this user, because maybe there's data that only this account has access to, or something along those lines. We might need to go and possibly go and back up some stuff still. But as quickly as possible, we're going to want to go and delete this account, folks. Alright, and then we've got something called account attributes and access policies, folks. So the first thing you need to know about this is every user account in your environment is defined by a unique security identifier, guys. We call this a SID. So if you go and create an account for somebody and then you go and create another account afterwards, it's got the same name and the same last name, whatever, it's not actually the same, because it will have a new SID, guys. So every account is defined by a unique security identifier that we call a SID. It's also defined by a name and a credential. Now, each of these accounts, folks, is also associated with a profile. Now, the profile, folks, this can be defined by custom identity attributes which describe the user, such as their full name, email address, contact number, department, so on and so on. I think you guys get the idea. So that's the additional custom attributes. The profile might also support media such as an account picture if you would like that. Not all companies do that. I mean, quite frankly, half the companies I've dealt with doesn't actually do that. Now guys, as well as these attributes, the profile will usually provide a location for storing user-generated data files. This could be something like a home folder. The profile can also store per account settings for software applications. So if that is needed in your specific company, which is often the case, it can do that. Now when it comes to access policies, guys, each account can be assigned permissions over files and other network resources and access policies or privileges over the use and configuration of network hosts. These permissions, guys, might be assigned directly to the account, or they can be inherited through membership in a security group or a role. So if you've got security groups, it is possible that they can possibly inherit it from that. Now, access policies, guys, they also determine things like the right to log on to the computer locally or via remote desktop. It also determines the rights to go and install software, change the network configuration, and so on. So with these access policies, if you want to allow your users to log on remotely via remote desktop, you can go and configure it there. If you want to allow users to go and configure network configuration, or you want to block them from doing so, this is one of the places you can go and do that. And then lastly, folks, on a Windows Active Directory network, good old-fashioned on-premises domains and all that, on these networks, access policies can also be configured via group policy objects. We normally call these GPOs for short. Now these GPOs, folks, they can be used to configure access rights for user group role accounts, and they can also be linked to network administrative boundaries in your Active Directory, such as sites, domains, and of course your good old-fashioned OUs, which are organizational units. So there's a bit of a picture for you guys, just in case you're curious what that may or may not look like. So guys, in case you don't know, group policies is something you normally do on premises, on an on-premises Active Directory environment. It's a little bit of extra I'm adding for you guys here. These group policies, there's over 3,000 settings and configurations you can go and configure for your users and their devices. Now, a lot of people are under the impression this is to go and block users from doing certain things. I wouldn't say that's wrong, but it's not the only thing you can go and do. So yes, you can block people from doing certain things on their own machines. You can go and turn certain things off, disable certain things, block certain things. But you can also go and use group policies to allow and turn things on. Or you can just go and use them to go and configure general things on your machine. So pretty much almost anything you can go and configure via the graphical interface can be done via group policy. It's just not normally something we'll go and use on our own individual machines because it's quite frankly easier and quicker to go and use the graphical interface. But if you find yourself in a sticky situation where you need to go and configure something on a lot of machines, possibly a couple of hundred or a couple of thousand machines, it's much easier to go and configure that once on the server and to push that through the network as a group policy to all your users. So this can be a policy for the user accounts, it can be a policy for the devices. The point is there's over 3,000 settings you can go and configure. So with group policy objects, this is all linked to that. At the end of the day, the stuff is all linked, folks. Alright, and then folks, I'm going to move you on to the last topic in this specific section, not for the video, just for this section, and that is account restrictions. Now what I'm about to explain to you guys and what I'm about to list is not the only restrictions there is. These are simply some of the most common ones and some of the most widely used ones. So the first category, yes, category, is location-based policies. I kid you not. And when it comes to location-based policies, you get something called logical network location policies. So that means somebody has to be in a certain IP address range, or they've got to be in a certain subnet. So they could possibly be in the same building for all we know. But just because you're in the same building does not necessarily mean you can log into whatever this resource might be. You might need to be in a certain section of the building. It might be based on your subnet. So if you're in a certain section of the building, you might be on a different subnet. Or you might need to have a certain IP address or a certain IP address range first before you can log into certain resources. Another location-based policy you get, folks, is geolocation. This normally works with a public IP address, but more recently you will see people also use GPS. Now this can be implemented on premises, but it's more common to see people using this in the cloud nowadays. If you go look at something like Microsoft 365, or especially something like Microsoft Azure, there's a lot of this going on. If you go and check, you'll see that half of the population nowadays are working from home. And because so many people are working from home, that becomes a bit of a security risk. Not something I'm going to go too deep into right now because the topic is geolocation. Now what you can go and do is you can force this person to be able to log in only from certain locations like their home address or like the office address. A lot of companies will go and configure this in such a way so their staff members or users or contractors have to be at the office. If you're not at the office, you cannot log in. Now, if it's based on public IP address, which is the more common one, that will be based on a public IP address. So if you go home, you're going to have a different public IP address and it's not going to log in unless that public IP address at your home has been specified as one of the allowed public IP addresses. Now, before you ask, yes, you can bypass this by using something like a VPN in case you guys are wondering. So if you guys are wondering about it, yes, it can be done. So if you look at something like a public IP address, let's say I've allowed only my office public IP address and I'm sitting at home. Yes, I can VPN to the office, which is basically teleporting myself there, digitally speaking, and I can pretend to be there. And yes, I will be able to access this resource. But if you really think about it, we are going to be blocking the right people and allowing the right people purely by accident. The people that's clever enough to figure out how to bypass this, that's not the people I'm worried about, because the people that's clever enough to figure this out, they're probably in IT, they're probably tech savvy, and they understand the risks in IT, they understand security risks, they know they need to have a strong password, they know they need to have the latest updates, and they know they need to have an antivirus which is up to date. So those guys are not my concern. My concern is the folks that don't know they need to have an antivirus which needs to be up to date and all those other things I've mentioned. Now, luckily for me, that's the people that's probably going to be blocked by this geolocation if it's an IP address based one. Now, as for the normal location services, like I said, that could be a GPS. It's not as popular yet, but it is an option. So if you go into places like Microsoft Azure, you can go and configure this to work on GPS location instead of public IP address. Now, that's going to be a little bit harder to go and bypass, but it's not impossible. So if you guys know what rooting is or what jailbreaking is, rooting is to go and unlock an Android phone's hidden developer options, and jailbreaking is to go and unlock an Apple device's hidden developer options. Now, once you do that, one of the options you can go and do there is to go and manipulate your GPS location. So it's not impossible to bypass this. Nothing is ever unhackable. Anything can be cracked or hacked, guys. It's simply a matter of we want to make this so darn gosh difficult to the point where the perpetrator, the threat actor, will hopefully get discouraged and stop and move on to something else. Now, as for account restrictions, guys, there's another category I've got for you guys. It can also possibly be a time-based restriction. I'm only going to give you guys two categories today, but there's many other ones. So when it comes to time-based restrictions, it could be that these people are only allowed to log in within certain hours. Only between, let's say, 8 o'clock in the morning and 5 o'clock in the afternoon. So if your business hours are from 8 until 5, your users will only be able to log in between 8 and 5. If anyone tries to log in after 5 o'clock or before 8 o'clock, they're not going to be allowed. It's going to be blocked. And 10 to 1, this is even going to send an alert to the IT team to go and look into what the heck is happening there. You can also go and specify logon duration. So how long is a user allowed to be logged on? So if they're, let's say they're working from 8 o'clock until 5 o'clock, let's say it's an 8-hour shift or 7-hour shift, you can go and specify 8 hours. So there's no reason why somebody should be logged on for more than 8 hours. If they are, it could be that they left the machine and they left it logged on. So that's a security risk. So whatever the reason might be, log on hour duration will specify how long an account can be logged in, after which it's going to disconnect the account automatically. Something else that's in this category is impossible time or risky login. So if someone, for example, logs in from home and maybe they log back out, and then 5 minutes later they log in from another location, possibly a coffee shop somewhere, but the catch here is this coffee shop they're logging in from is probably like an hour away or 5 hours away. How is it possible that you can log in from one location and then 5 minutes later log in from another location which is actually an hour or 5 hours away? That is impossible time travel. It's impossible travel. So that's most likely a situation of somebody else has logged in with that person's account. There's something funky going on there. So maybe the first login was the user and the second one was not the user. Or the first one was not the user and the second one was the user. But one of these logins, possibly both of them, was not the user. It's a sign of an account that may possibly have been compromised, which is why it might even possibly block the account. Lastly, folks, temporary permissions. This is most commonly used for contractors, consultants, guest users, that kinds of shenanigans. It's not limited to that, obviously, but it's most commonly used by those types of accounts. So you can go and assign this via multiple ways. Once again, I'm going to refer to something like Microsoft Azure. It's just one of the places I've seen it's most commonly at. It's not the only place. There's other platforms and softwares and stuff that uses this as well, guys. But the most common place you guys will find this these days is in the cloud, because everything is becoming remote and everything is moving into the cloud. So if you have not seen it yet, you're going to see it sometime soon. You can go and create an account for someone with temporary permissions, and instead of you having to go and remember to go and revoke these permissions afterwards, the permissions will automatically expire after a certain period. So this could be time-based, so after, let's say, exactly 30 days, the permissions falls away. Or as soon as the project gets completed, the permissions falls away. So you can go and choose often what the trigger will be for the permissions to fall away, but you don't have to go and remember to go and remove it manually, because you might be busy, you might not remember, or you might just not be in the mood, quite frankly. You don't have to go and worry about that anymore. Alright, folks, so that's the last topic for this specific section. Let's move you on to the third and the last main section in this module, which is identity management.
Alright, the first topic up in this last section, folks, is local, network, and remote authentication. Now, a lot of this stuff you guys probably know already, especially if I start talking about it, you're going to see it's going to sound familiar. But before we get to the familiar part, the first thing I want to get out of the way here, folks, is one of the most important features of any operating system is, of course, the authentication provider. Now, this is software architecture and code that underpins the mechanisms by which the user is authenticated before starting what is known as a shell. Now, guys, knowledge-based authentication, in other words, a password, a PIN, a phrase, that kinds of mumbo-jumbo, this relies on cryptographic hashes, in case you guys didn't know. A plain text password is not usually transmitted or stored in a credential database, because this is at risk of being compromised. Now, instead, guys, because this is at risk of being compromised, the password is instead stored as a cryptographic hash. Now, when a user enters a password to log in, an authenticator converts what is typed into a hash and transmits that to an authority. The authority compares the submitted hash to the one in the database and authenticates the subject only if they match. Now, getting to the part you probably know already, but you never know, maybe I'll teach you guys something you did not know. Windows authentication. Good old-fashioned Windows authentication. The one that you guys most likely know is Windows Local Sign-In. So when you've just installed the Windows 10 or the Windows 11 operating system or any other operating system before that, that machine is on what we call a work group scenario. Has not been joined to any domain yet, if you know what that is. It's only on a work group scenario. Now that account, if there's one account, might possibly be more than one, but it's usually just going to be one. That account might not even have a password, because if it's a local account, there's no rule that says it has to have a password. Domain accounts and cloud accounts, yes, those are normally going to have a password. It does not allow you to have a blank password. But a local account can possibly have a blank password. Now, regardless of what the password is, if you or the user goes and types in their password, it's going to check locally on that machine if you or the user are who they claim to be. If you're the owner to this account or this device, it's going to check locally in something called the SAM. In case you guys didn't know, SAM is actually short for Security Accounts Manager. Most people don't know what that means. All you need to know is there's a small little database locally. You don't even need to know that it's called SAM. There's a small little database locally. It's going to check in that if you are who you claim to be. It's part of the registry, in case you guys didn't know. So if you are in there, great. You're going to be authenticated. If you're not in there, well, tough bananas. You're not going to be authenticated. Now, the second kind of Windows authentication you get, which is probably becoming more and more common by the day, is a Windows network sign-in. Now, on its own, when I just say it like that, it sounds fancy, and quite frankly complicated. But believe it or not, guys, this is a good old-fashioned domain login, an Active Directory account or a network account. So if you have an on-premise Active Directory, which, let's face it, most companies have these days, and you have a machine that's been joined to that company's domain, you will be able to sign in with a domain account. Or should I say, an Active Directory account. So with a Windows local sign-in, the previous one, you need to click an account and type the password if there is one. You don't have to type the account in, you click on account. With a Windows network sign-in, you don't click on the account, you need to type in a username.
Once you type in a username with its associated password, it is not going to check locally if you are who you claim to be. It's going to contact a central point of authentication, which is your Active Directory server, which has got the ADDS role installed normally. So all the machines that's been joined to the same domain will contact the same central point of authentication, which is your Active Directory server, guys. So you can use the same username on multiple machines, assuming you have not restricted it down to certain machines, of course. The last one we get, folks, is a remote sign-in. This simply means somebody can be sitting at home and they can log into an account like their company account. Now, on its own, this does not always work, especially if you go look at something like a remote desktop and things like that, because you are on a different network. You're not at the office, you're not on the office network. So if I take my company laptop home and I just try and log in with my company account on the office network, yeah, it's not going to work. You need to remotely connect to the office somehow before you can go and log in. And one of the ways you can go and do that, not the only way, it's probably just the most common way, is a VPN, a virtual private network. If you use a VPN, which I did this briefly discuss earlier in the last topic by accident, it's like digitally teleporting yourself somewhere where you're not. So if I VPN to the office, it's as if I'm in the office. Anything I could normally see and do while I was in the office, that applies now. But it's a double-edged sword, so anything that I'm normally blocked from doing, that will also, apply now, but that's not the topic right now. So if I VPN to the office, I will in fact be able to log in with my office account, just in case you guys didn't know. So that is Windows authentication, guys. Windows Local, Windows Network, and Windows Remote Sign-In. Alright folks, moving on to one of the last topics in this section. It's a short section, and no, it's not the last topic, it's one of the last topics. That will be single sign-on authentication, which is very commonly known as SSO for short. So everybody just refers to this as SSO normally. Now if you don't know what this is, in a nutshell, it means a user, possibly yourself, you will still need to log in, type in username and password or whatever it is you're normally going to do. But instead of you being harassed by the system, whatever it is, to continuously type in your login details, you'll just ever so often have to go and type it in. So you just go and type it in now, once maybe, and then as long as you're on the same browser session or whatever this is, you're going to have access. You're not going to have to continuously type in your credentials the whole time. So the benefits to this is it allows you and the users to be more productive because you're going to spend less time logging in the whole time. Drawbacks to this is if it's not implemented correctly, guys, this can be very dangerous. This can be your company's downfall. So in a nutshell, a single sign-on system allows the user to authenticate once and then to receive authorizations on compatible application servers without having to enter credentials again, like I said earlier. Now, one such example, not the only example, guys, is Kerberos. Probably butchering the name there. Now, this, guys, is a single sign-on network authentication and authorization protocol which is used on many networks, including Microsoft's Active Directory service, mind you. Now, Kerberos, in case you guys don't know, was actually named after the three-headed guard dog of Hades. In other words, Cerberus, because it consists of three parts, in case you guys didn't know. Now, how this works is clients request services from the application servers, which both rely on an intermediary, a key distribution center, in other words, which we just call KDC for short. So I'm just going to call it that from now on, to vouch for their identity. And there are two services that make up this KDC that I just referred to. So this key distribution center, it consists of two services, guys. That is the authentication service and the ticket granting service. Now this Kerberos, folks, it can authenticate human users and application services. These are collectively referred to as principals. So it doesn't matter whether you're a human user or whether this is an application service, all of them are referred to as principals. Using authentication to a Windows domain as an example, the first step in a single sign-on is to authenticate with a key distribution center, which is implemented as a domain controller, guys. So hopefully you guys know a little bit more now about what single sign-on is. In a nutshell, if this is configured correctly, like I said earlier, it can make your life and users' lives a lot easier because they can only have to type in their credentials once. They're going to be able to be way more productive. And then if you don't do it correctly, this can be your company's downfall because people that's unauthorized might potentially gain access to stuff they're not supposed to have access to. Alright folks, before we move on to the next topic, I'm just going to quickly play a bit of a game with you guys. So if you guys have been on my channel before, you would probably know what game I'm referring to. Normally this happens a little bit earlier in the video, but today it's going to be way at the end of the video.
So what I like to do with my viewers is I like to give them a secret code word or a code phrase. And if you guys want to play along, you can either go and type this code word or the phrase in the comment section down below. You can either do it as is, but that on its own is no fun. Or you can go and make a sentence with this word or this phrase. So anybody that's not been watching the whole video would have no cooking clue what's going on. So if they go and read through the comment section, they'll probably be wondering, what the heck is going on here? Why are people talking about this or that so much? And if they get to the video up to this point in the video, they'll know, oh, okay, that's what's going on. So it's more of an inside joke for the people that actually is studying very hard. So considering how hard you guys have been studying, if you've been watching the video up until this point, clearly you're studying very hard. And I think you guys deserve to laugh a little bit. So this is just to get you guys to smile and laugh a little bit. The guys that doesn't study very hard wouldn't know what this is all about. So today's code word is funky monkey. So you guys can go and put that down below. So see if you guys can go make up some sort of sentence using the words funky monkey. I think I've used that one before in another video, but this was like 2 years ago maybe. So use the words funky monkey. You can either type it as is, or you can go and make a new sentence. If you are going to make a new sentence, which is my preference, just stick to YouTube's rules and policies, of course. Don't go and swear. Don't go and say something mean. Otherwise, the YouTube popo is going to be on our case, so let's not do that. Keep it discreet, guys. Let's have fun with this. And yes, you are still allowed to go and ask questions down below as well. So if you want to go and put anything else in the comment section down below, possibly a question about something you've seen in this module, you're more than welcome to do that. And I'll answer you guys down below as quickly as I possibly can. Alternatively, you can join my Discord server. The link is in the video description. It's literally way at the bottom of the video description. You can go join that. It's a community which I'm in. There's other IT trainers in there, other students in there. You can go and ask your question there as well. Somebody will get back to you. Or if you just want to feel like helping people, then you can also go and join that community. All right, guys. So on to the next topic, which is the last topic in this module, federation. What is that? You get so many kinds of federation, but generally this comes down to when you're working with two different platforms or two different companies and they've got their own identities. Now, if I have my own platform or company and you have your own platform or company, that becomes a bit of a problem because I don't have an account on your environment and you don't have an account on my environment. But what if our environments trusted one another? Now, this concept, guys, we're actually seeing this everywhere around us these days. We just don't realize it. So this concept, folks, is when networks are under separate administrative control, but they share user identities. One such example is if you guys go on Reddit, if you know what Reddit is, you'll find that Reddit actually allows you to log in with your Google account. You can go and log in with your Google account. You can go log in, I think, with your Facebook account, other accounts like that as well. So Reddit trusts Google, or Reddit trusts Facebook, or whatever other options they give you there. So you are logging into your Facebook or your Google or whatever other options they've got there. You're authenticating to Google or Facebook or whatever. But now you're logging into Reddit and you didn't actually authenticate on Reddit. It's because Reddit trusts those other identity providers. The same concept applies to other things. I think Twitter does that too, if I'm not mistaken. I think Twitter is now called X. I don't really use Twitter, but I should probably start using it more. So this platform called X, you can do the same thing. You don't have to go and create an account. You can sometimes just log in with your existing Google account or your existing something else account. I think Instagram does the same thing as well. So you don't have to create an account. You can log in with another existing account and use that as your authentication provider, because this platform you're logging into trusts the other platform. It saves you a headache. It saves you hassle. It's just an all-round smooth experience. So this is often going to work with what we call identity providers and claims. So the one identity provider has got a claim on the other one. It's going to go and ask the other provider, hey, do you know this person? So when I log into X with my Google account, X is going to go and contact Google and say, hey, listen, bro, do you know this person? That's basically what it comes down to. All right, folks, that is finally the end of this module, which is module 4. I really hope you guys have learned something in today's module. If you have, please let me know down in the comment section down below what you have learned that you might not have known. It's always fun to see what people have learned that they might not have known. And then, of course, guys, just a shout out and thank you to everybody that's supporting me on this channel. So thank you to the guys clicking on the thanks button if it's available in your country. Thank you to those of you buying me a milkshake and coffee. All of this is basically available in the video description down below, guys. So if you would like to support this channel or me in some sort of way, you can find that in the video description down below. So you will be able to do a donation there or buy a coffee or a milkshake or whatever. You'll even find my Patreon link down below as well. You can do PayPal donations. It's all fully optional, guys. Now, speaking of the supporters and all that of this channel, here is a list of the PayPal supporters that's been doing donations in the background. Thank you very much, guys. And then here is a list of the Patreon supporters. Now, I think at this point in time, there's hundreds of them. The last time I checked, it was like over 500. They're probably way more by now. And most of them are actually not on this list because they prefer to stay anonymous. So normally if you become a paid Patreon, there's a free option and there's free tiers. If you choose one of the free paid tiers, I will normally contact you and ask you if you would like to be on this list. And if you say yes, then you have to give me a name of your choice that you would like to have displayed on this list. And then you can stay on this list, obviously assuming you're staying as a paid Patreon. So here is a list of the Patreons. And unfortunately, like I said, these are only the ones that said I could display their names. The other guys decided to stay anonymous. Lastly, folks, just a reminder, the channel does have a Discord server. It's called Free IT Training. So the link is in the video description down below. It's the last link at the way bottom of the video description. Alternatively, if you are in Discord server, when you are in Discord server, at the bottom left, just click on that option there to go and run a search. And in the search, you just run a search for Free IT Training and it should pop up there as well. Alright, folks, I hope you've learned something. I will see you again in Module 5 of Security Plus.